While the world continues on an edge, wondering when or if even Israel is going to launch its counterstrike against Iran. A lot of things a lot of the signs start adding up that that's something that could be imminent and could be coming very, very soon. We had just recently, Netanyahu had canceled his defense minister's trip to Washington, where ostensibly they were going to coordinate activities and understand plans and exchange ideas. That was canceled, which led a lot of people to think that maybe something is about to come, or else maybe Netanyahu didn't want to be told no on anything he was going to do. And that certainly wouldn't be the first time that's happened. But to try to unpack a lot of this and kind of where it's going and what may be happening next, we have the amazing Alexander Mercouris from the Duran on our show today. I'm absolutely delighted and thrilled to have you back. Welcome to the show, Alexander.
And I am delighted and thrilled to be here, even in these very difficult times that we're going through.
It's always good to be able to talk to somebody who's got a rational idea and can look at things for the way they are, and can talk about the good and the bad as they exist. And that's one of the reasons we value your insight so much. So glad to have you here. Let's just jump right into this. I want to just kind of, though, before we really get into this and ask you kind of, we were talking a little bit before we came on the air here. And one of my concerns is that, forget about for the moment whether Israel is going to launch into Iran and whether that's going to blow up or not. It looks to me like, especially from a military and a logistics perspective, that Israel may already have bitten off more than it can chew. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm not obviously a military person, but I have had experience of logistics to some extent. I think that I look at Israel, a relatively small country. Is it 9 million people, limited resources? It's got powerful armed forces, but they're not infinite in scale. And it's now fighting in Gaza. It's fighting in South Lebanon. Its economy is under stress. It's engaging in Syria. It's engaging in Yemen. And now it's thinking of taking on another country, Iran, with a big industrial base, population of 88 million people, an immense territory, much of it mountainous, much of it presumably difficult to fight on. And Iran, of course, is a powerful country with powerful friends. And taking on everybody like that, all at once, all at the same time, however strong you think you are, however well organized you may believe you are, well, that looks to me like all together too much at once.
And it's really interesting to me. There has to have been some sort of fundamental change in the Israeli Defense Forces and in the way that they think about war. Because you look back at the 1967 war, 6 days. The 1973 war, I think it was 19 days. Even the 2006 Second Lebanese War, 34 days. They were in, they were out, they had attainable objectives, and then they moved on out of there. And now then here you have 365 days and counting in the Hamas war, in the Gaza Strip, and basically just kind of reset and started all over from the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and they're moving more to the south. They're continuing to have these skirmishes going on in the West Bank, and there's no end to any of them. You mentioned the strikes into Yemen against the Houthis. There's no, at least apparent, attainable military objective they've even given to their military other than just to strike targets, which of course will respond, get all kinds of responses necessitated in that regard here. I just don't know what the thinking is at the strategic level to now you're at a year with an open-ended war that still festers, as you started in something that, as you pointed out, is much, much more difficult and large in southern Lebanon. And they've got targets that go up almost into the middle of Lebanon. So I just don't understand what their thinking is, and wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the one thing you would expect Israel, a relatively small country, to want to avoid at all costs is a protracted attrition war. And that seems to be what Israel is choosing to fight. It's choosing to fight. It's fought it in Gaza. It's now trying to fight it in South Lebanon against Hezbollah. Hezbollah, of course, is just one of many different actors in the Middle East that are all allied to each other. And it's taking all of these people. And again, you're quite right. What is the objective? What is the plan? Destroy Hezbollah? How do you achieve that? Israel, of course, has fought before in Lebanon. We both, I'm sure, remember the 1982 war and what followed. That didn't end very well. We've had other conflicts in Lebanon as well in 2006. One would have thought this is ground which Israel knows well enough to steer clear of. And the other thing I would say is, I cannot understand why this has to be done now, when all the indications are that the other side was looking for a way out anyway, that they didn't want a war of attrition or a prolonged war. They understood how devastating and difficult it would be, and they were prepared to agree a ceasefire or some kind of understanding of that kind. So you're throwing that away. You're rejecting ideas of a ceasefire. You're plunging into a war in southern Lebanon. You've got a war ongoing in Gaza. You're fighting in the West Bank. You're fighting with the Houthis. You're bombing Syria. And on top of that, on top of everything else, you now apparently want to launch some kind of strike against Iran. And quite right, what is the objective? What is the ultimate plan? What do you expect to do?
Well, now, one of the things it appears to me, I want to stick with the Hezbollah part for a moment. We're definitely going to hit the Iranian possibilities here in a second. But Netanyahu said something a couple of days ago, and it just strikes me as a bit odd when you're getting into what you want to obtain, because it seems like from the clip I'm about to show you that maybe he's just wanting the Lebanese to just say, you know what, we're going to quit. And we're all in mass going to turn against Hezbollah and, I don't know, hand them over to you. Here's what he said.
You deserve to restore Lebanon to its days of tranquility. You deserve a Lebanon that is different. One country, one flag, one people. Don't let these terrorists destroy your future any more than they've already done. Stand up and take your country back. You have an opportunity that hasn't existed in decades.
How do you think that message is going to be received by the people of Lebanon? Because he started that off by saying this is a message to the people of Lebanon.
I mean, they are not going to accept it because, of course, they know perfectly well who, first and foremost, is bombing them. I've had some conversations with people from Lebanon, including people, by the way, I know who are not favorable to Hezbollah. And all I will say is my impression is that resistance is stiffening, as it always does when there is an attack of this kind. But beyond that, listening to Netanyahu, it reminds me so much of Menachem Begin talking in 1982 during the war that took place then. He was saying exactly the same things. I mean, I can actually remember it. I mean, people like Begin, I think Sharon was then the defense minister. We're going to defeat the terrorists in Lebanon. The people in Lebanon, we're going to regain their country. There'll be freedom in Lebanon, peace in Lebanon. And the result was, they tried to install a new government in Beirut, led by a man called Bashir Gemayel. He lasted just a few days before he was assassinated. The war then resumed. Israel found itself trapped in a prolonged insurgency war in southern Lebanon, exactly the places that we see now. And it turned out that the Lebanese people, or at least a significant, a critical mass of Lebanese people, did not welcome this liberation, if you like, that the Israelis said that they were offering them, and instead fought against it. Why assume it's going to be any different this time?
And I'm wondering, I mean, is there any substance to that? Is there any reason why that you can divine that Netanyahu would think that somehow this is going to be different? Then that message may actually have some effect, because if it doesn't, then you wonder what was the purpose of it.
Well, I think you again put your finger on it, because I think that is the assumption. I think the assumption behind this operation is that Hezbollah is extremely unpopular in Lebanon. Hezbollah itself is a weak and fragmented organization, that it's going to collapse under the blows that are being dealt upon it, and that the Lebanese people are going to rise up against it and are going to support the Israelis. Now, these are assumptions. I don't know what intelligence Netanyahu is receiving which supports those assumptions. I don't think they're correct assumptions at all. I think that Hezbollah has already absorbed very strong blows and they're still fighting. So it doesn't look as if they're going to collapse. And as for an uprising on the part of the Lebanese, again, I don't get the sense of that. In 1982, Lebanon had just come out of a civil war. Lebanon had been a party in that civil war. One could understand why, there were divisions that the Israelis could exploit from that civil war. Lebanon has been in a kind of unstable peace over the last couple of years. Not a real strong peace, but anyway, it's been a peace in which Hezbollah has been a strong organization. It's got deep roots in Lebanese society. Many people from the Shia community support it and belong to it. I don't think that they're going to turn against Hezbollah simply because Netanyahu wants them to.
In order to do that, what would they be turning towards? Because it seems to me that they would almost of necessity be just submitting and surrendering to Israel and say, we're going to now be a vassal state. And I just don't know what would give anyone motivation to do that. And Alexander, it reminds me of something I personally observed in 2010 when I deployed for my second combat tour into Afghanistan. That was one of the big chunks of what we were attempting to do there, was to separate the people from the Taliban. The Taliban was very unpopular among the people of Afghanistan. They didn't like being ruled underneath them. And we were going to them. And I distinctly remember going to several villages where we met with some of the elders. And we said, look, man, y'all just turn with us. And I mean, your future lies with us and with this new government of yours. And, just tell us where these guys are and we can go after them. And I'll never forget this particular sheik was, he just looked really nervous. Like he was always looking around, like wondering if anybody's watching. I said, nope, there's no Taliban here. There's not any. They're never here at all. So don't even need to worry about it. And then as we're talking, we had some security details that were kind of going around the perimeter of the village, and they brought a Taliban guy in there that they had captured who was trying to get intelligence on us, et cetera. And it just underscored that they were more afraid of us than they were of the Taliban, who was at least of their kinsman type and at least of their nationality. So I think that when you see Benjamin Netanyahu, the idea that they're going to listen to him and turn against people of their country just seems absurd to the extreme.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think they should listen to your advice and draw on your experience and draw on the experience of the many Israeli officers and soldiers who have fought in Lebanon, who I'm sure have had exactly the same experience. I've never seen a war change a society in the way that people want it to from the outside. If Lebanon is going to change, if there's going to be a change on the part of the Lebanese against Hezbollah, then absolutely they will do it themselves. They will not want the Israelis coming in and doing it for them, and certainly not in this way when they're killing hundreds, thousands of Lebanese civilians. It just doesn't make any sort of sense. It just convinces. And again, I'm talking, it's anecdotal, but Lebanese people I have spoken to, and there's a lot of people like Lebanese people here in London, they all say the same thing. Whatever our views about Hezbollah, we feel that it is Israel which is attacking us.
Yeah. And as we talked about at the outset, if that's all there was, I just, either from a military, strategic, and economic, I just don't see any path for Israel to come out on top of this, or to even bring anything into fruition that's going to make any kind of sense. But unfortunately, that's not where it stops. And now then we have Yoav Gallant, who came out earlier to say, hey, we are going to strike Iran. Not that we're thinking about it, but we're going to. And here's how he described what it's going to look like.
You saw the strikes that Iran launched against us a short time ago. Those strikes were aggressive, but they failed because they weren't accurate. Just as we have been doing until now in the war on all other fronts, whoever attacks us will be hurt and will pay a price. Our attack will be deadly, precise, and above all, surprising. They will not understand what happened or how it happened. They will see the results.
Okay, so I want to ask your thoughts on two aspects of that. On the first one, he says that the Israeli strikes, I'm sorry, that the Iranian strikes in the 2000, I'm sorry, the 190 or 80 missiles that were landed were ineffective, and they were missed their targets. Do you buy that?
Well, I have to base this on what others are saying because, you know, I don't have the intelligence, but there's a huge article today in the Daily Telegraph, and it draws on people from Israel. It looks at all the various satellite data. They say that a lot of the Iranian missiles got through, a lot of them, perhaps 30 of them out of 180, and that they did real damage, that they hit the Israeli bases, the air bases, that they did damage to those bases, that one of the missiles detonated close to the Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. And the article goes on to say, and it's in the Daily Telegraph, that, well, you got it up there, the next strike could be devastating. In other words, even at this point, when they launched this particular last strike, the Iranians, who again clearly do not want to be in a long-term war with Israel, were to some extent pulling their punches. So I think that it looks a bit complacent to say that this was a strike that wasn't accurate and it didn't achieve its purpose. There seem to be people who've looked at this and have studied things carefully, who are coming to exactly the opposite conclusion.
Well, yeah, and we had MIT professor Ted Postel on our show, who did an analysis, a detailed analysis of exactly the same thing, came to the same conclusion that the next one could be much worse. You've had the Minister of Defense of Iran saying that the next one would be much worse and would go after different targets than they did the first time. But that doesn't seem to have deterred Iran or Israel any. And then that leads me to the second part of the question I wanted to ask you from what Gallant said there. And that is, what do you think these powerful and lethal and surprising strikes are going to result in? Now, it's one thing to launch into a ground invasion of Lebanon, which is a very poor country, has no air force, air defense, virtually anything. And it's going to be a tough slog to try to unseat them. They assassinated Nasrallah, so they've taken out the leader. They've taken out a couple of others since then, too. So they keep on going after that. But the animal itself, the existence of Hamas, the resistance, is going to continue on. But you go now into a state that has, as you said at the outset of this show here, an industrial capacity. It does have a lot of weapons that it can use. What do they think is coming next?
Well, I don't know what they think is coming next. Again, I can't help but think that there's the same assumption underpinning this, that the regime in Iran is unpopular, that people dislike it, that if you hit it hard enough, it will collapse like a house of cards, something of that sort. I don't think that is true at all. Again, if you're talking about Iranian society, I think that the government there is indeed controversial. A lot of people do not like it. But ultimately, like happens with every country, if the country is attacked, they will unify. And if that assumption that the Israelis are making, which is the only one that can explain what it looks like they're going to do, if that assumption is wrong, then they're going to be in a war of attrition with a much bigger country, I mean, far bigger country than Lebanon, with an industrial capacity, with military that can strike anywhere it seems across Israel itself and the Middle East, and which has powerful regional connections. It's got friends across the Middle East, and it's now, of course, a BRICS state. It's a member of the BRICS. It's got a connection with Russia. The Russian prime minister was recently in Iran. The president of Russia is meeting the Iranian president in a few days. All of this is going on. You would not want, I would have thought, when you've got all of these other problems, all these other wars that you're fighting, to widen the war and take on this apparently very powerful country and find yourself potentially in a long war of attrition against it, because that, it seems to me, is the risk.
That's certainly what it looks to me like. but it doesn't seem that any of these things are dawning on any of the Western supporters either. One of the things I would have at least theoretically imagined is that, well, you know what? We are not, United States being, are not in this fight directly, and we don't have the emotional connection you do. So we're going to try to breathe a little bit of cold water on some of this stuff to bring rational thought back into this until you cool the jets here. And if you want to do something that's like, that's going to get you into a war you can't win, you're going to do it with your own stuff, because we're not going to aid and abet it. That's what I would think, if we really cared about Israel, we would be doing to help them avoid making a tremendous strategic error. But as your Boris Johnson said, I think it was today earlier, he was saying, listen, forget about all that stuff. If Israel wants to do it, let's go. Watch this.
I think that UK, US, and Israel are all allies and friends, and we're all democracies. And that's the difference between us and Hamas, Hezbollah, and the regime in Tehran. And whatever people say about Israel, whatever people say about the tragedy that's been unfolding in Gaza or in Lebanon, the heart bleeds for the people there. But in the end, Israel is trying to deal with people who want to wipe them off the map, wipe the Jewish state, wipe the Jewish people off the map. And that's very, very hard to deal with. And I think the lesson of the last few years is that the democracies of the world, the freedom-loving countries, need to come together and stand up for our values. And that means we can't let Israel be destroyed in that way. We have to stand with Israel.
Okay, now I'm really troubled by the language that he uses there when he's talking about the Western values, and just sort of minimizes, okay, sure, it's bad about the Palestinian people who are dying, but whatever. Anyway, the bigger issue, and then going on to something, talking about how these extremely poor entities, all of which we're talking about, whether it's the Houthis, Hezbollah, Hamas, etc., they're all non-state actors. All of them, non-state actors with limited capacity. Hezbollah has the most, but even that is very, very limited. And he's talking about how they want to wipe Israel off the map as though that were a legitimate possibility, as opposed to Israel that does have and is literally trying to wipe these people off the map, so to speak. How does that strike you?
Well, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think that the idea that any of these entities could pose that kind of threat to Israel, that they could seriously wipe Israel off the map. By the way, I mean, the idea that Iran has that capability also, I mean, it seems to me utterly far-fetched. I mean, the Iranian Islamic Republic has been in existence for 45 years. It's never shown any possible ability to wipe out Israel, or any desire to, actually. I mean, they may talk from time to time in that way, but I mean, at the moment, they have got some kind of an economic upswing underway. They're sorting themselves out with the BRICS. They're doing all kinds of things. Every indication suggests that, far from seeking conflict, they want to avoid it because they understand that they're weaker. Now, they have the capacity, I believe, to defend themselves, but that doesn't translate into a capacity to destroy Israel. And the problem with Boris Johnson, and it's a problem that you encounter time and again, is that these people never sit down and analyze and discuss and say to themselves, is what we are proposing something which we can actually do? What is our plan? What is our strategy? How are we going to achieve it? What if all our assumptions turn out to be wrong? Simply saying Israel is a democracy and we must support it, it's not a strategy. It's a pose. It's a cliche at the end. And you don't make war on the back of cliches.
Well said. That is well said. Although that seems to be the Western way these days. One of the things he also meant is about the values, and I'm just telling you, as an American, I'm troubled by the fact that we talk a lot about wanted a ceasefire in the Hamas situation. We tried to get that a lot. We wanted a 21-day ceasefire in southern Lebanon, etc. And yet, while we're advocating for that, we're providing all the ammunition that's falling on these people. And we literally have funded, I think, $145 million to help alleviate the suffering in Lebanon, while we're providing the bombs that are destroying the people that make them need all of this stuff. It's just a really just kind of at cross purposes thing here. And the New York Times, I think it was yesterday, published a piece by 65 medical professionals that had been serving within Gaza Strip specifically. And they said they were very, very troubled because, and one of the quotes from it is, but one of the many things that stood out about working in the hospital in Gaza, one got to me. Nearly every day I was there, I saw a young child who had been shot in the head or the chest, virtually all of whom died, 13 in total. Then he went on to once he'd gotten back, that was in March and April of this year, they got with a bunch of other Western medical professionals who had also volunteered time, and they found out that 44 of them also saw lots of evidence of children being physically targeted, basically like snipers shooting children, and they were all under teens, so it was all kids. And you know, we also had separate from this in the, I think it was the USAID here in the United States, a report that validated that Israel was preventing humanitarian aid from getting to where it was going, which was causing more suffering. Our Secretary of State was briefed on it, ignored it, put it aside, and continued on talking stuff like Boris Johnson did. When you hear that, and obviously that gets around the world, and you're talking the New York Times, not some fringe anything. Yeah. What is it happen? What is the result when you hear, whether it's Blinken or Boris Johnson talking about Western values when they see this?
Well, what it tells people in the Middle East, what it tells people across the Islamic world. I was recently in an Islamic country. I was in Malaysia, and what people say there is that when Westerners talk about values, they don't really mean what they say. It's simply a concept that they've weaponized and use against us, but which they never apply to themselves, because we see what's going on in Gaza. We see children being killed in the way that these people and these doctors have described in the New York Times. And suddenly nobody talks about values then. Nobody talks about human rights. There isn't investigations. There isn't concern about atrocities. There isn't even an attempt to find out what's actually going on, whether, these are soldiers who are, out of control and behaving by themselves, or whether they're conducting some kind of policy, or, whether their officers have lost control of them, or what exactly is going on. There isn't any interest in finding out the truth. And that tells people in across the Middle East, across the Arab world, across the Muslim world, and in the wider world also, that the West cares only for some people and not for others, and that in the case of Israel, Israel is allowed to do basically whatever it chooses, however bad it is. And let's not hear any more about values, because when it comes to Israel, anything goes.
That's hard to argue with that, and one imagines that probably a lot of those comments are whether it's Johnson or Matt Miller and our State Department and John Kirby. They make these kind of comments all the time. I think that's for a domestic audience, to make us feel better, like we're actually standing up for these things, and just don't look over here behind this curtain about what's going on. And I'll tell you, Alexander, I think that's going to come back to haunt us one day. I think it's going to be, I think it's much more serious than what it looks like here. But be that as it may, that's what we have to deal with at the moment. I want to shift gears real quick and go to another issue that I really like your input on and your views on, and that is the Russia-Ukraine war, now continuing to grind on, closing in on its third year. Now, there's a lot of question there about how much longer the Ukraine side can even continue to fight, and there's lots of physical evidence on the battlefield. Just in the last 24 hours, there have been significant moves in the Karakova area. Selidova has is now starting to be surrounded. Toretsk has seen a huge advance by the Russian army just in the last day or so. Seversk area, Kursk is now starting to crumble, and that they're actually, the Russian side looks like they're trying to cut it off at the neck, which is going to put all of these guys up there in this untenable position to where they're either going to die in place, surrender, or to try to evacuate really quickly. I think they're running out of time. Everywhere you want to look on the front, it's crumbling from the Ukraine side. But from the Western side, you keep still hearing all these comments about how we're going to continue to support everybody. Now, first of all, I want to show you here a comment toward the end of last month by Zelensky, because this was on the eve of coming to the United Nations for the UN Security Council. He wanted to get permission from Biden to use long-range weapons and wanted more gear, etc. But he wanted to come give his victory plan. Here's what he said then.
Your victory plan, does it include negotiating with Russia? And how can you trust someone?
It's not about negotiating with Russia. No, it's about, like I said, it's a bridge to diplomatic way how to stop the war. The bridge is a plan of victory or victorious plan. It's a strengthening of Ukrainian army and Ukrainian people. Only in the strong position we can push Putin to stop the war, diplomatic way. And only with a strong position we can speak. That's why we're asking our friends, our allies to strengthen us. It's very important.
So let's try and just kind of parse what he said there and try to find out what his actual intent is, because she asked him at the first of it, does your victory plan include negotiating with Russia? And he said, no, there's no negotiation. But then a couple of sentences later in the same clip, he said, we want to be in a stronger position to have a diplomatic and political outcome. I mean, I thought that was the same thing. So if it's not the same thing, I don't understand what it is. How do you read that?
Well, I mean, it's inconsistency to the point of absurdity. But I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to create some kind of international coalition. At least this is the sort of theory of it, which will then come together, bring all the countries in the world together, the global South, the West, and all of those, and they will somehow pressure the Russians, force the Russians economically, diplomatically to back down. It's not going to happen. It is completely unrealistic. By this stage in the war, with everything falling apart, and with every indication, that just ahead of a big BRICS summit meeting in October, the Russians have solid positions with all their various friends. It's far too late to be indulging these fantasies. And people should be telling Zelensky this. They should be saying straightforwardly, what you are saying doesn't make any kind of sense. You cannot have a diplomatic outcome without negotiations. You must sit down and talk. You are losing the war, and there is only so much we can do to help you. We've done an awful lot. We can't realistically do more.
Well, that's certainly what we should say, but that doesn't appear to be what we have said. So here is, I think this was, this is today when Zelensky met with Keir Starmer. Watch this exchange.
Very good to welcome you again back here. Very important we're able to show our continued commitment and support for Ukraine in this such important fight for you and for all of us as well. So very good to welcome you back to go through plans to talk in more detail about the work we can do together.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Thank you for having us. Me and my team, thanks to UK people of your great country, for your strengthening us from the very beginning of the war. And today I want, of course, to share with you details of the victory plan.
Yeah.
So interpret for us, if you could, what is Keir Starmer actually telling him there?
Well, he's telling him that Britain is behind him and that he should continue the war, which is very much the policy that we have in Britain. We have no real plan about how to end the war on favourable terms. We're not supporters of negotiations. We have been consistently one of the most hardline and aggressive countries in terms of this war. And the new government that came in Britain, the Starmer government, has gone exactly where the Conservative government did, the outgoing one did, except it's gone even further. Its rhetoric has been even harsher. It's been talking about missile strikes deep inside Russia. It's been wanting to step up get the West to step up support for Ukraine even more, even though, as I remember you saying way back in 2022 when it all started, and you've been proved absolutely right, there is no pathway to victory. Now, at that time when you said it, well, it was optional to disagree, but you've just described the military situation, and well, there it is. Nobody's really addressing the problem that all of these places are either about to fall or are being surrounded, and that the Russian army is closing in. That isn't something that people want to talk about openly. You find it written about in the media, some places, not all as much as they do, but Keir Starmer just carries on exactly as if it was early 22, exactly where Boris Johnson started back in 2022. We are all fully behind Ukraine as long as it takes for Ukraine to achieve victory, even when it's obvious that it's crashing to defeat.
Now, I would have liked to have hoped that, well, that's just what Starmer said in front of the cameras. But when they got back off stage, behind when they were just having their actual one-on-one meeting, that he would then tell him maybe something similar to what you did, that, look, here's the reality. You're just not going to be able to succeed. And I'm not completely sure if this came before or after, but I think it came after. You had the new Secretary General Rutte come out of his meeting with Starmer and said this.
When we discuss Ukraine, we know it's tough because the Russians are making small advances in the east. By the way, at a considerable loss of life on the Russian side. So they lose a lot of people, people dying, people getting seriously wounded, but still the Russians are making those small advances. We are not only into this because of the fact that we want to support Ukraine. Yes, of course, that is the main reason. But also because supporting Ukraine in this fight against Russia is crucial for our collective safety here in this part of Europe, in Canada, in the United States, all over NATO territory. Because if Putin would get his way in Ukraine, that will mean a serious security implication, have a serious security implication for all of us in NATO.
Okay. Let's do a little review of the bidding here, because he made a really big statement there that, oh my God, we've got to stop these crazy hordes at the gate, or they're coming for all of us to Canada and the United States. Even somehow he's going to get across the Atlantic Ocean. I didn't talk about that, but don't ask those questions. He just will. But then he also started off that sentence talking about how that Russia is inching along on the Eastern Front. And even though they made some pretty good moves in the last 24 hours, when you're looking at it over the course of 2 and almost 3/4 of a year now, by what logic do you say that same Russian army is going to suddenly pose a threat to a 32-member military alliance?
Well, I mean, it's an absurd idea. It is completely ridiculous. The idea that, we've got to stop them in Selidovo or Kurakovo, or they will be marching on The Hague and London and Washington. I mean, it's just, it is so detached from reality that, one just doesn't understand whether these people really have thought this through or believe it themselves, because it is ludicrous. It is completely ludicrous. All it is doing is prolonging a war which is destroying Ukraine. If you want if you want peace in Europe, the way to do it is through negotiations and diplomacy, and there are routes to that. I mean, the Russians have said they're open to negotiations. If you don't believe the Russians, the friends of the Russians, China, Brazil, India, they've all said they want to see negotiations. So you can actually find a route back through negotiations. But of course, Rutte isn't talking about negotiations. He says we've got to go on supporting Ukraine, even though, they're being pushed back, because, if we don't stop them there, they'll come and attack us here. I mean, it is a fantasy. It is, I just don't have further words to talk about it.
And it's not like Europe is behind all this. I mean, we obviously have with Viktor Orban in Hungary, or with Fico in Slovakia. You can even add in Erdogan from Turkey. Now, even Schultz in Germany is also saying, hey, you know what? It's really time to talk. So you see that there's a definite fissure going on in Ukraine. I mean, sorry, within NATO. So there does seem to be a growing amount of space to say, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Now, on top of that, there was supposed to have been in 2 days, there was going to be a meeting in Ramstein, Germany, where the president was going to show up this time, along with the Secretary of State. But now all of a sudden, they canceled that. Biden ostensibly didn't go because of, watching the hurricane blow through Florida here. But, that happened last night. That wouldn't have stopped him from going there. And by the way, I don't know that he's going to really help that too much in Florida. But be that as it may, he canceled. But then so also did the Secretary of State. And then finally they said, we're just going to cancel the meeting altogether. So now at a time when you got Zelensky trotting around Europe saying, hey, I need a bunch of stuff, and then the meeting to give him the stuff gets outright canceled, what does that tell you?
Well, as a British person, it tells me that Britain is at very serious risk of being isolated in this issue, because we are demanding that there should be no compromise on Ukraine. We are going along with hardliners like Mark Rutte and some of the people in NATO, the Secretariat in NATO. But it is clear that the ground is shifting under our feet, because people across Europe, where, by the way, the economic situation is very poor, partly because of this war and its blowback and its consequences, which nobody thought through properly. People in Europe are beginning to rebel. They're saying, well, we can't continue like this. Ukraine is losing. The Russians are winning. Our economies are suffering. We've got to try and see if we can find some way forward. And people in the United States, and this is how I interpret the decision to call off Ramstein at the last moment. Well, they've been hearing Zelensky talk about his victory plan. They've been hearing him talking about deep missile strikes into Russia. They hear the British backing this, and they don't want to go there. They don't want Ukraine at the moment joining NATO or deep missile strikes into Russia. And they're not happy that the British, for one, are advocating these things. So they're staying away from Ramstein so that they can avoid having to address those topics, having to argue directly with some of their allies, notably the British, some of the Scandinavian states, the Baltic states, even as ultimately they're saying no. So we in Britain are going to find ourselves isolated in this. Now, the problem is, looking at the others, yes, they do I think they do now understand that Ukraine isn't going to win this war. That the question is, how long before the Russians win this war? And that would be a very bad thing for Europe after all that's happened, if the Russians won the war, conclusively. So we've got to find a way out. But nobody so far is putting forward proposals, serious proposals, as to how to do it. The Ukrainians, Zelensky, at the moment is resisting the idea of negotiations. He ruled out negotiations, as you saw in that interview. And all of the indications are that some key governments in NATO, the British, Scandinavians, the Baltic states, some of the others, Mark Rutte in Brussels, they're still ruling out negotiations also. So we're going to have to find a way through to get some kind of dialogue with the Russians underway. And that's going to be very difficult because we are divided. And the Russians, for their part, have good reason now to be very skeptical of any ideas we put to them. But that is the only realistic way forward. And it is the only humane way forward. And it is the only sensible way forward for Ukraine.
But it's self-evidently that should be to any rational thinking person. And look, the situation I just described to you, the tactical situation on the main points of combat here a second ago. But then you look at things from the operational and strategic level, and they're even stronger in Russia's side. I mean, of course, their industrial capacity is just now cranking, just like 24/7, 365 and expanding even. They continue to expand the size of their military, now up to, by the end of the year, it'll be around 1.5 million on active duty alone, which is 50% bigger than it was when they invaded in February 2022. Now then we see that there may actually be some North Korean soldiers fighting on the ground alongside Russia in Ukraine. And we don't know how many are coming for. The South Koreans have said they have intelligence on this report here. And so we already know that North Korea is giving considerable ammunition support, whether that's artillery shells, rockets, and we don't even know for sure what else. We just know there are literally thousands of containers being sent on ships over to Russia. We, of course, know that lots of support is coming from Iran. China is reported to be doing a much more help to the Russian side than what's been publicly announced. So everywhere you look, that's the overall dominant theme, is that everything in the cumulative West that we're doing is failing at every point. Now, on top of all this, here's what Sergei Lavrov has said, that there is still an opening for a diplomatic solution. We actually desire one to end the conflict, not just have a ceasefire. And he's point blank said that that's going to mean you're going to lose Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Crimea, and then there's going to be no NATO. Now, ironically, some of those were part of the April 2022 deal that didn't happen in Istanbul. NATO was always going to be off the table, but those other territories could still have been in Ukraine. Now, the longer it goes, the worse it's gotten. And so that's where we are today. Russia, subsequent to this, I think it was the deputy foreign minister, also added that if those are not taken, the next time it's going to be even worse. So let me ask you then. Now, I get it that a lot in the West hate Russia. And whether it's, leftover mentality from the Cold War or something else, I don't know. We just don't like them. I can get that. I may not agree with it, but I understand people don't like somebody. But when you look at all of those fundamentals I just laid out there, and none of them are in our favor, and they're not going to be, and by all rights, the probabilities are like 98% probability that the Ukraine army will eventually collapse just out of sheer weight for all this. And now that we're not worrying about whether we're going to fire long-range weapons into to Russia, we're going to see what are the terms of surrender. And then it's going to be so much worse for us then. Surely those kinds of calculations are not lost on even people in Washington and London.
Well, I would sincerely hope so. I mean, I'm not sure about London, by the way. I mean, if you look at Keir Starmer and our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, and listen to what they've been saying, I'm not sure that they do get it. But you are absolutely correct. Now, it is a tragedy that we threw away the possibility of peace that was presented in April 2022 in Istanbul. That allowed Ukraine to remain intact. They didn't even have to recognize that Donetsk and Lugansk, the regions, those parts of the regions that the Russians still control, they didn't even recognize that those had become part of Russia or Crimea. It was actually a very good deal for Ukraine. It was a very good deal for the West, by the way. Also, it would have ended the war and it would have secured peace, and we would have been able to move forward. And a lot of the disaster that we have, would have been avoided. It did not affect what was agreed in Istanbul, or potentially agreed in Istanbul, did not in any way undermine core Western interests. Now, the interesting thing about Lavrov's proposals, which are basically Putin's proposals, he put them forward in June, is that they still do not, in my opinion, undermine or detract from core Western interests. I mean, why is the future of the West dependent on who is in control of Lugansk? I mean, I just don't get it. I mean, I really don't get it. So it's still a negotiation, which perhaps we can, argue around the edges. We could say, well, maybe you can keep Lugansk. We won't recognize it, but for the moment, we can find a way around. At least we can negotiate on this, and we can come out and we can preserve Ukraine. And if we don't do this, well, then, exactly as you say, the overwhelming probabilities are that the Russians will move further west. We will get into a situation where there is less of Ukraine to defend. The Ukrainians will have suffered even more than they have done. Their cities without power, their people dying on the battlefronts, all of that. And then, of course, the Russians, having moved further west, they will demand more. And they will say, look, what we were offering in June 2024, that's historic now. We're looking at new realities on the ground, and we got to adjust to those new realities. And that's a difficult argument to push against. And then, of course, if we reject that, the point will eventually come when there is nothing of Ukraine left. I cannot for the life of me understand why we would want to be in that situation. And I cannot for the life of me understand why anybody who says that they care about Ukraine would want Ukraine to be in this situation.
Yeah. What do you make of the argument that some advocates for continued support make, that it would send a message if we did what Lavrov has offered here, what Putin said back in June, et cetera, or any version of it at all, and entered into negotiations that ended up with Russia getting something that they didn't have on February of 2022, that would send a signal. And that China, for crying out loud, they would regard the weakness of the Americans. They especially saw with the terrible withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021. And now with this on top of it, they would definitely move into Taiwan. What do you say to that?
Well, I think, again, it's absolutely absurd. I mean, it's the domino theory all over again. We've got to hold back the Russians, because if we don't hold the Russians, the Chinese will move. They will move against Taiwan. I mean, these are completely unconnected issues. The Chinese, of all people, understand the true strength of the military balance in the Pacific and the enormous risks that they would run if they started an operation in Taiwan, which would be a completely different one to the war in Ukraine. Right. And beyond that, I mean, there'll be the economic consequences, which would be extremely severe for China as well. I mean, this argument makes absolutely no sense on its own facts. But, if that is your concern, if your concern was, that if you find yourself in a war with the Russians and you lose it in Ukraine, that might affect the situation in Taiwan. Bad argument though that is. Well, that would have said, try and avoid getting into a war in Ukraine in the first place. Implement the Minsk agreement, which was agreed way back in 2014.
It was already on the table.
It was all on the table. Do it and avoid a war, because as no less a person than Barack Obama, when he was still president, said, in Ukraine, the Russians have the advantage. So you don't want to fight them there. It is obvious. But anyway, I think I've said enough.
So let me ask you, in the last few minutes we have here, let's say that we maintain our current course, which is to ignore reality and just keep this fiction in our own minds. And I'm talking about Washington and London primarily. And we're just going to keep saying, yep, support them as long as it takes, et cetera. And then I guess the laws of gravity take effect and Russia eventually wins. Whether they come up with a big arrow operation, which is entirely possible in my view, this fall and winter, or whether they just stick with the current plan and just say, no, even if we have to go another, 6, 9, 12 months, we're eventually going to grind them down. That's going to get there. So whether it's quicker or later, that will eventually happen as long as Russia continues to fight. In that event, how do you think that the West, and we'll stick with the UK if you want to stick there, how will they react when there's no longer the possibility of giving fiction because the war is lost and the Ukraine side has lost? What are we going to do then?
Well, I think what we're going to be saying to ourselves is we've lost this war in Ukraine and there's going to be divisions in Europe. There will be some people in Germany, in Italy, in Hungary, and all those places. And they say, look, we weren't completely in favor of this enterprise. isn't it time to talk to the Russians? And there will be others like the British who will say, well, look, you see how aggressive and how powerful the Russians are, and we must build up our defenses in Europe even more. And we're going to have tensions and arguments in NATO, which are going to be far worse than the arguments we have now. But think what would happen if the hardliners, the British, ultimately won that argument. And by the way, the hardliners have won all of the arguments consistently up to now with the results that we see. We would have another Cold War, another confrontation in Europe. We would ask the Americans, again, because it can only be the Americans, to send a lot of their army to Europe again to confront the Russians all over again. That would be a huge commitment of US resources in Europe to defend us from the Russians. And all of this at a time when the United States has problems in so many places, in the Middle East and the Pacific, wherever you like.
Economic, add that to because that's probably the more dangerous.
Exactly. All of those. Do the Americans, and it ultimately has to be decided, by the way, by the United States, do the Americans really want to be in this position? Surely they should try and find an end to the war now on the terms that the Russians are proposing, which, as I said, do not undermine or affect
Western security
or core interests.
It doesn't. And man, I wish that was you on the stage with Zelensky today, or I wish you were on Keir Starmer's staff to breathe some of this rational logic, common sense into some of his ears there. But I guess we'll have to leave it at that and let this be our speaking so that people can hear, because a lot of people are watching our shows here. We've seen some reporting here in recent days, and really even the last couple of years, that more and more people are starting to turn away from mainstream media because they recognize, just listening to it, that a lot of the stuff is just nonsense, and they like voices like yours that are telling it like it is, that lines up with what they can see and understand in the world. So we really appreciate you coming on today and providing more clarity and vision on this. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. And can I just say, they should also listen to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And in fact, if you guys haven't liked and subscribed, please do so today, because we love to be able to give you information like this. We, of course, also want you to know that we're on podcast now, Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcast Addict. Be sure to type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will be shown right away to our podcast. Thank you very much, and we will see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.